All right, hello everyone. Today we are going over lesson 11 of the AP Chemistry Unit 3 curriculum, which is on spectroscopy and the electromagnetic spectrum. Spectroscopy is a very powerful tool that we use in chemistry because it lets us determine the structure and the concentration of different substances found in a mixture. Today, the learning objective is to explain how different regions of the electromagnetic spectrum are linked to specific types of molecular or electronic transitions. So first we have microwave radiation. It has a relatively low energy and it's associated with molecular rotational transitions, which basically just says that it causes the molecules to spin. Infrared radiation has higher energy and corresponds to molecular vibrational transitions like stretching and bending bonds. And UV or visible radiation carry even more energy, and they are connected to electronic transitions where electrons move between energy levels. So spectroscopy works by shining different types of radiation on matter and then studying how the molecules respond. When we talk about light in chemistry, we're really talking about energy that's either absorbed or emitted by matter. So the kind of light that we can see with our eyes, which is called visible light, is just one small part of a much larger range of electromagnetic radiation, which we can see with the electromagnetic spectrum. Light behaves like a stream of tiny packets of energy that we call photons. Each photon carries a specific amount of energy, and that energy depends on the frequency of light. So the diagram here shows how this works. An atom can absorb a photon, and that energy moves an electron from a lower energy level to a higher energy level, which is now called in an excited state. But excited states are very unstable, so eventually the electron falls back down to its ground state, and when that happens, the atom releases energy as another photon of light. And we represent this energy change with the equation, the change in energy equals h times v. H is going to be Planck's constant, and v is going to be frequency. These variables and equations are all found on your reference sheet for AP Chemistry. To really understand spectroscopy, we need to look at some important properties of light. First, light can be described using wavelength and frequency. So wavelength is the distance between two peaks of a wave, and the frequency is how many waves pass a point per second. So these two properties are related. So when wavelength gets shorter, frequency is going to increase. But light is also very strange because it doesn't behave just like a wave. Sometimes it also acts like a particle, where individual packets of energy called photons interact with matter. So this concept where light can behave like a particle and a wave is called particle-wave duality. And it's central to modern physics and chemistry, and it helps explain why light can both bend around objects like a wave and also knock electrons off a metal surface like a particle in the photoelectric effect. So the image on this slide is a visual representation of light's dual nature of being both a wave and a particle. As you can see, there are wave-like patterns moving through space that represent light behaving as a wave with peaks and troughs, but at the same time, you see bursts of light and particles, and those are going to represent photons, which shows light's particle behavior. When we describe light as a wave, there are three key terms we need to understand: amplitude, wavelength, and frequency. So amplitude is just the height of the wave from the midline. It's connected to the brightness and intensity of the light. The larger the amplitude, the brighter the light appears. Wavelength, like we said on the last slide, is the distance between two peaks of the wave. For visible light, wavelength determines the color. For example, shorter wavelengths look violet or blue, while longer wavelengths look red. And then frequency is how many waves pass a fixed point in a given time, and those are usually measured in hertz. Higher frequency means that the waves are moving faster and carrying more energy. One of the most important things to remember about waves of light is that wavelength and frequency are inversely related, which means if our wavelength is longer, our frequency is lower, and if our wavelength is shorter, the frequency is higher. So the equation that describes this is C equals lambda V, where C is our speed of light constant, which is found in your AP Chemistry reference sheet. Lambda is your wavelength, normally given to you in nanometers, and V is your frequency. Since the speed of light is a constant, if one of the variables goes up, then the other variable is going to go down, which is why they are inversely related. And so using this information, let's go ahead and try a brief practice problem. If I gave you a light that had a wavelength of 500 nanometers, go ahead and solve for the frequency of that light. So we know C equals lambda V. We're solving for V, or frequency, so we'll have the speed of light over our wavelength. The speed of light is 2.998 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. And we have 500 nanometers, and we can see in our constant we have meters, so we need to convert nanometers to meters. I know that 1 nanometer is going to be equal to 1 times 10 to the negative 9th meters. So I will have 500 times 10 to the negative 9th, or 5 times 10 to the negative 7th, and that will be meters. That gives us 0.5996 times 10 to the 15th. Putting that in scientific notation, with the correct number of sig figs, I technically only give you one sig fig. That would give us 6 times 10 to the 14th. And that would be seconds to the negative first for frequency units. When we think of light, most of us picture the colors of the rainbow, which is known as the visible spectrum. But visible light is actually just a very small fraction of what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. So this spectrum covers all wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, from very long radio waves to extremely short gamma rays. And I want you to notice the pattern on the right here. As your wavelength is increasing, your frequency is decreasing. And as your wavelength is decreasing, your frequency and your energy is increasing. That's why gamma rays have such high energy and can penetrate matter, while radio waves have very low energy and are mostly used for communication. In the diagram, the small section in the middle that is expanded is what we know as the visible spectrum. So it ranges from about 400 nanometers, which we know as violet light, which has a very short wavelength, to 700 nanometers, which is red light and has a longer wavelength with lower energy. This is very important because spectroscopy uses different regions of this spectrum to study matter, depending on whether we want to measure rotation, vibration, or electronic transitions in molecules. At one end of the electromagnetic spectrum, we find gamma rays. These have the shortest wavelength and the highest frequency, which means they carry the most amount of energy. Because they are so energetic, gamma rays are classified as ionizing radiation. This means they can knock out electrons out of atoms, changing their structure and sometimes damaging biological molecules like DNA. So gamma rays can pass through most matter very easily, which makes them both useful and dangerous. For example, gamma rays are released in nuclear reactions and in outer space events like supernovas. They're used in cancer treatment to target and destroy tumor cells, but they can also cause severe radiation damage to healthy tissue if it's not carefully controlled. So the main idea here with gamma rays is they have a short wavelength, high energy, and can be very dangerous if uncontrolled. Next up, we have X-rays just below gamma rays. and they have a very short wavelength and high energy, which allows them to pass through many substances that visible light cannot. For example, X-rays can go through soft tissues like skin and muscle, but they are absorbed by denser materials like bone and metal. And that's why X-rays are so useful in medicine, because we can send X-rays through a body and capture the pattern of absorption, which then can create an image of internal structures like bones and organs. So the key takeaway is that X-rays can penetrate matter, but it depends on the density of that matter, making them a very essential imaging tool, especially for the medical community. Ultraviolet or UV radiation is just beyond the visible light on the spectrum, with shorter wavelengths and higher energy. UV radiation can be harmful to humans in high doses. That's why we wear sunscreen. The sunscreen blocks out or absorbs UV rays and reduces damage. So these are the three types of UV radiation. You do not need to know the types, but in case you are interested, they are there for you to read. The visible light spectrum is the tiny part of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes can actually detect. It covers wavelengths between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers. At the short end of around 400, we see violet and blue light, which have higher frequencies and higher energy. At the long end of around 700 nanometers, we see red light, which has lower frequency and lower energy. The colors of the rainbow, violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, red, they're all part of this visible range, and the differences we see in color come directly from the wavelength of the light. So this region is also very important in chemistry, because visible light spectroscopy is used to measure concentrations of solutions by looking at how much light is absorbed at a certain wavelength. So that's the principle behind Beer-Lambert law, which we are going to look into in lesson 13. All right, after visible light, we have infrared or IR radiation. IR radiation does have longer wavelengths and a lower energy than visible light. It's the type of radiation that we experience as heat. So warm objects, including our own bodies, emit infrared radiation. And that's why thermal cameras, like the one in this image, can see heat and create those colorful pictures that show temperature differences. In chemistry, infrared radiation is especially important because it causes molecules to undergo vibrational transitions. This just means that bonds will stretch or bend or twist when they absorb IR energy. So the important part of this specific radiation is that it is experienced with heat and vibrational motion of molecules. All right, next up we have microwaves. Microwave radiation has longer wavelengths and lower energy than infrared. In chemistry, microwaves are associated with rotational transitions, which means they provide just the right amount of energy to make molecules rotate faster. We all use microwaves for cooking food. Microwaves are going to cause water molecules in food to rotate rapidly, generating heat and warming the food from the inside out. So the key idea here is microwaves drive molecular rotation, and that property makes them useful both in science and in different technologies from day to day. At the far end of the spectrum are radio waves. So these have the longest wavelengths and the lowest frequencies of all of the electromagnetic radiation. And because their energy is so low, radio waves are not dangerous to humans. Instead, they are extremely useful for communication. So radio waves are used to transmit signals for AM and FM radios, cell phones, Wi-Fi, and TV broadcasts. If you look at the diagram, you can see how a transmitter sends out radio waves and a receiver picks them up. And then by tuning to different frequencies, we can pick up different stations or signals. So the key idea is that radio waves carry information over long distances. not energy that interacts with molecules. So let's look at a few of our questions from the 3.11 to 3.13 AP Classroom. This first one says, which of the following best explains what happens as photons of visible light are absorbed by dye molecules? So to think back what we learned, visible light is associated with electronic transitions. That means that photons in this region have just the right amount of energy to move electrons from a lower energy level to a higher one. So looking at the options, A says electrons move to a higher energy level, and the difference matches the energy of the photon. That matches our definition, so A would be correct. But let's look at the other options. B talks about bonds bending and stretching. That's infrared radiation, not visible light. C talks about molecules rotating faster, and we know that that's caused by microwaves, so that's not our answer. And D talks about covalent bonds breaking. That requires much higher energy, like UV or gamma rays. So the best answer is going to be A, visible light photons excite electrons to higher energy levels. This next one says infrared spectroscopy is a useful tool for scientists who want to investigate the structure of certain molecules. Which of the following best explains what can occur as the result of a molecule absorbing a photon of infrared radiation? So we know infrared radiation is linked to vibrational transitions, which is bonds bending or stretching or twisting when they absorb IR light. So when you're looking at these options, you need to look for the word vibrational, and then if you have two options that talk about that, look for something having to do with bonds bending or stretching or moving in response to that light. So the correct answer would be B. Infrared photons excite molecules into different vibrational states, which is why IR spectroscopy is so useful for identifying bond types and functional groups. This question is asking why infrared spectroscopy is a good method to confirm the presence of a carbonyl group. Remember, infrared radiation excites molecules into different vibrational states. So each type of bond vibrates at a characteristic frequency, which means bonds show up as unique signals on an IR spectrum. So A says infrared causes electrons to move to a higher energy level. That is electronic transitions, which happen with UV light, not infrared radiation. B says absorption of infrared radiation increases molecular vibrations. That one is the correct answer. C talks about electrons in a pi bond moving to a higher bonding energy level. That again would require UV light. And D mentions rotational transitions, which are caused by microwaves and not infrared. So B is the best answer. All right, the infrared spectrum above represents the absorption of certain wavelengths of radiation by molecules of CO2. Which of the following best explains what occurs at the molecular levels as the CO2 molecules absorb photons of the infrared radiation? So I know the last couple ones have been about IR, and we know IR radiation is associated with transitions in vibrational levels. So the answer would be A, which is talking about the atoms bending and stretching.